Has this ever happened to you during Holy Mass? You receive the Eucharist, and suddenly the consecrated host stops on your palate, refusing to dissolve. You freeze. For a moment, you wonder what you should do. You feel a bit self-conscious. Maybe you try to dislodge it with your tongue, but it stays right there, silent. What if that small moment wasn't just a coincidence? What if it were actually a signal from heaven, and you simply didn't know yet how to recognize it? Comment below. Jesus, help me understand your signs, if you too have experienced something similar. Thousands of faithful around the world share the same story, but only a handful have ever wondered what its true meaning is. And even fewer have paused to reflect. Maybe God is trying to reach me through this. Hang in there with me, because soon you'll discover 5 hidden truths that could forever transform the way you experience communion. And the starting point of this spiritual journey comes from the words and meditations of Pope Leo the XIV, a man of profound prayer, of interior discernment, and of extraordinary Eucharistic sensitivity. The Holy Father, through his catechesis and reflections, has guided many believers to rediscover the living presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That real presence, which is not limited to the external gesture, but transforms the soul of those who receive it with faith. The pontiff often speaks with both gentleness and authority. He doesn't force, but guides. He doesn't raise his voice, but fills it with light. His words are born from prayer and listening, and those who follow him know that every teaching of his spring from the desire to lead souls closer to the heart of Jesus. In his teaching on the Eucharist, Pope Leo the 14th invites every believer to recognize those moments that the world tends to ignore, but which for the saints have always been the most precious signs of God's presence. When the host stays still on the palate, when time seems to slow down, the Holy Father invites us not to brush it off as merely physical, but to recognize it as a call from heaven that breaks through our routine to capture our attention. It is from here that the 5 hidden truths we will now discover together are born. The first is one that almost no one notices. The 5th is the one that few have the courage to listen to. The first truth, as Pope Leo the 14th calls it, is a divine pause. There's something Pope Leo the 14th often emphasizes when speaking of this first truth: the power to carry the silence of the altar into everyday life. He says you don't need to hunt for extraordinary occasions. The small pockets of daily life are plenty. A hospital corridor, a bus seat, the kitchen at home when everyone is asleep. In those places, the soul can repeat the gesture learned in church, which is to remain. The Pope invites us to do it with simplicity. Breathe in. Pronounce the name of Jesus in your heart. Let your breath become prayer. So when the host stops, you're practicing not pushing God's timing. And when you walk out of church, you learn not to rush others either. The divine pause becomes patience toward those you love, kindness toward those who don't understand, meekness in difficult moments. The Holy Father speaks of seeing people turn anxious days into moments of peace thanks to one simple decision. Don't react right away, but wait alongside the Lord. It's a practical way to protect the encounter and not let it slip away right off. It's choosing to linger one moment longer in love until your soul can breathe easy again. Sometimes God doesn't speak through the roar of wind or the noise of the world. Sometimes he speaks in silence, through a simple gesture inviting us to pause. When the consecrated host stops on your palate and doesn't dissolve right away, it's not a nuisance, but a sign. It's the way the Lord asks you to stay with Him, not to rush ahead, to let yourself be touched by the mystery. The Pope often says we're living in a time starved for noise and distraction. Even inside the church, while receiving communion, our minds race. We're thinking about what comes next, who we'll run into, how much longer till Mass wraps up. But when that little unexpected moment happens, that silent pause, it's as if heaven were saying, "Hold on, I'm right here. Don't rush ahead. Stay with me." It's an invitation to step into the deep quiet where we recognize God's voice. The Pope often quotes the psalm that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Those words capture the whole meaning of the Eucharist. Stop doing and simply be with Him. When Christ gives Himself in that tiny piece of bread, He's not asking for actions or words, but attention, wonder, love. This is why the Holy Father repeats that the first form of prayer is silence before the presence. And the moment the host stops becomes a sacred time, a little altar right inside you. In that instant, you're not just another believer in church. You're a soul in conversation with its Creator. There, in your mouth and in your heart, heaven and earth touch. And if you truly stay present and listen, you'll discover it's no accident, but an encounter God prepared just for you. Pope Leo the 14th explains this is also a sign of how distracted we've become by the world's pace. We've gotten used to rushing through everything, even our faith. But God won't be rushed. He waits for you. He stops you. And in the silence, He teaches you to breathe in sync with His breath. The second truth, as the Holy Father teaches, is equally profound and often ignored. The second truth, the guarded presence, also carries a gentle responsibility. When you walk out of church, you carry with you what you've welcomed in. Pope Leo the 14th suggests a simple practice. In the minutes after communion, think of one specific person you want to bless and ask Jesus to work through you to reach them. Words aren't necessary. A simple gesture works, a phone call, a forgiveness you've been holding back for too long. The Pope shares the story of a father who, after years of being harsh with his son, decided to hug him right as he left Mass. He didn't say anything special, but that embrace was born from the Eucharist and healed a distance that went back years. Another woman wrote about how she changed the way she worked. Every morning, she silently offered her activities as an extension of the communion received on Sunday. Over time, she found that even her most difficult co-workers began to soften. Whoever protects Christ, says the Pope, becomes a protector of others. And it's not just nice words. It's the logic of received love, seeking a home to dwell in. So the presence doesn't fade when the host dissolves, but keeps on living in everyday acts of charity. When the host stays intact in your mouth, you're no longer just receiving. You become the one who carries. The Pope says, in that instant, you are a living tabernacle. You have within you the body, the blood, the soul, and the divinity of Christ. It's not symbolic, it's living reality. In you dwells the Lord of heaven and earth. This is why Pope Leo the 14th invites the faithful to live communion with a sense of profound wonder. Not to treat that moment lightly, not to be in a hurry, not to act as if it were just a ritual. In that instant, the entire heaven is gathered within you. It's the moment when grace pours into the soul like a light that purifies everything. The Pope often points to the example of saints who, after communion, would stay completely still for minutes, even hours, as if caught up in a love beyond words. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote that after receiving Jesus, she felt like a living monstrance, bringing the divine presence into the world. And the Holy Father, reflecting on those words, reminds us it's not reserved for a select few. This is what happens to every believer who receives the Eucharist with faith and love. In those moments of silence, says the Pope, Satan tries his best to distract. He whispers useless thoughts, creates haste, sows impatience. But whoever stays with Christ in the silence, whoever refuses to be pulled away, receives a grace that transforms their soul. Because the host doesn't just touch your mouth, it touches your heart, reshapes it, makes it new. Pope Leo the 14th said during one of his catecheses, "When Christ is truly within you, every instant becomes eternal. Every breath, every heartbeat is an act of adoration." This is why the Eucharist is the greatest miracle. God not only gives himself, but remains. While the host stays still, you're not simply sitting in church. You've become church. In you dwells the one who created the universe. And even if it only lasts a few seconds, it's the holiest moment of your entire week. In his teaching, the Pope often points to the saints who truly grasp this mystery. Saint Faustina, who after communion saw rays of light streaming from her chest. Saint Tarcisius, who chose death rather than let the Eucharist be desecrated. Saint Gemma Galgani, who would stay in ecstasy for hours before the tabernacle. They were souls who didn't treat that moment like a habit, but like a meeting with love itself. And the Holy Father, reflecting on their experiences, invites every believer to do the same, to recognize the living presence of Christ who dwells in us. And with this perspective that begins at the altar and flows into daily life, we go deeper into the workings of the heart. What you receive in the intimacy of Mass is meant to expand into every corner of your life, turning ordinary time into time filled with grace. The third truth, says Pope Leo the 14th, concerns our heart, because how we react in that moment reveals the condition of our soul. If you feel restless, if it bothers you, or you try to speed things up, maybe God is showing you how unsettled your spirit really is. But if you feel peace, if you stay in adoration, if you welcome that silence with gentleness, then you're already worshiping in the purest possible way. The Pope explains that moment acts like an interior mirror. It reflects how we're actually living our faith. You don't need to speak or do, just listen. The Lord looks at the heart, the Holy Father reminds us, citing Scripture. And when the host stops, it's as if Christ is showing you the temperature of your soul right then and there. Once, during a gathering with some of the faithful, Pope Leo the 14th shared the testimony of a woman who had sent him a deeply moving letter. For years, the same thing kept happening to her. Every time she received communion, the host would stick to her palate, and she'd feel embarrassed. She thought it was disrespectful, a sign she wasn't worthy. But one day, while listening to one of the Pope's teachings, she realized it wasn't a bother at all, but an invitation. From that point on, she stopped trying to get it off quickly and instead stayed in silence, letting Christ speak to her. And in that moment, she experienced a peace she'd never known before. The Pope wrapped up that story with simple but powerful words. Don't be afraid of God's silence, because it's in that silence that He reveals His love to you. The fourth truth, as Pope Leo the 14th teaches, touches on the mystery of love hidden in God's faithfulness. In the fourth truth, that of God's faithfulness, the Holy Father invites us to see another layer. Christ staying with us creates our ability to stay with those going through hard times. He speaks of married couples who've weathered really tough years without giving up on each other, not out of stubbornness, but out of Eucharistic love. He says the Eucharist trains us in staying power. It makes us able to start over 1,000 times, to ask forgiveness when we mess up, to keep choosing what's good even when it costs us. An elderly catechist once told him she'd started visiting a lonely neighbor every week. They didn't have much to talk about. Often they'd just sit in silence. Yet that shared quiet became prayer. The Pope commented, "Adoration begins in church, but continues beside those who suffer." Whoever learns this kind of faithfulness isn't looking for fireworks. They make soup, straighten up a room, hold the hand of someone who's afraid. These are tiny gestures, but they're God's language. Because love stays even when everything else is shaking. When the host stays put, it's as if the Lord wants to remind you that He too stopped, made Himself small, became silence, all for love of you. It's the sign of a God who doesn't force Himself on us, but waits, who doesn't shout, but whispers, who doesn't overpower, but offers Himself, leaving you free to welcome Him or turn away. The Pope explains that this is the most tender face of Christ, the one who stays. There, in your body, the Creator of the universe hides Himself in silence, with endless patience. He doesn't make noise, doesn't demand anything, but His presence alone is enough to make holy everything you are. In that instant, the world could fall apart. But inside you, there's God who's silent and loving. Never forget, the Holy Father said during one audience, that the Eucharist is the school of silent love. Whoever learns to stay before Jesus in the Eucharist learns to love the way He does, with gentleness, with humility, with perseverance. This is why that small moment, the host that stays still, can become one of the deepest lessons in the spiritual life. Because God chooses silence to teach us real love. The kind that isn't chasing feelings, but faithfulness. The fourth truth is therefore an invitation to let that silence reshape you. When Christ stays in you, He's transforming you, even if you don't realize it's happening. It's like a seed sprouting in the dark earth. You can't see it, but it's working. It's acting, changing, healing. It's grace growing inside you without making a sound. Pope Leo the 14th explains that often the biggest graces are invisible. They don't come with spectacular signs or visions, but with a peace that slowly seeps into your heart. A calm you can't quite explain, but that lets you know God is at work. And that moment of silence, that host that stays still, could be exactly where a hidden miracle begins. Once the Pope told the story of an elderly priest who'd lost his voice. He couldn't celebrate Mass the way he used to, and he lived with that pain. But every time he received communion, he felt a deep warmth spreading through his chest. He said that forced silence had become his most powerful sermon. Because even without words, he knew Christ was speaking through him. And Pope Leo the 14th wrapped it up. When we have nothing left to say, God speaks louder. Now we come to the fifth truth, the most difficult one, the one that few have the courage to welcome. It's the truth that, if understood, can completely change your relationship with the Eucharist. The Pope calls it the test of the heart, because sometimes, when the host stops, it's not a sign of tenderness, but of correction. It's as if the Lord were saying to you, I'm looking for you, but I don't find you fully present. In those moments, says the Pope, God doesn't reproach you, but calls you back with love. He invites you to return with your heart, not just with your body. He reminds you that communion is not a habit, but an encounter of love. And like every encounter of love, it requires attention, purity, sincerity. Pope Leo the 14th explains that when you receive the Eucharist distractedly, or with your heart weighed down by sin, Christ remains in you, but cannot work fully. His grace finds obstacles, like a river that encounters rocks in its course. And then God stops, waits, calls you with gentleness, hoping that you truly open yourself. That host that stops is not a sign of rejection, but an appeal to conversion. It's as if Jesus were saying, "Let me enter into the depths. Don't remain on the surface." The Pope often speaks of the purifying power of confession, a sacrament that reopens the doors to full grace. And he invites the faithful not to fear approaching God's mercy, because only a purified heart can taste the sweetness of the Eucharist. During one of his homilies, he said, "Jesus is not scandalized by your falls. He only grieves when you don't get back up." And it's precisely in that moment, when the host stops, that God shows you his greatest compassion, the patience of love that never gives up. At this point, the Pope invites everyone to reflect on a question. What are you doing with that holy time? Are you filling it with haste, or are you letting it become prayer? Because, he says, everything depends on how you respond to that silence. You can live it as a bother or as a grace. You can see it as a delay or as an appointment with the eternal. Pope Leo the 14th loves to repeat that faith doesn't grow in grand gestures, but in small faithfulness, and that the Eucharist is the greatest school of patience and love. Whoever learns to remain before Christ in silence, he says, learns to live every pain, every trial, with hope and trust. Because every time you receive the body of Christ, something in you is healed, even if you don't feel it. Then, the Pope always remembers that even the saints experienced moments of dryness. They didn't always feel God's love. Sometimes, during communion, they felt only emptiness. But they continued to believe, and that gesture of pure faith was their greatest offering. Saint Teresa of Calcutta, for example, went through years of interior silence. Yet she never stopped receiving the Eucharist. She said, "When I don't feel Jesus, I know that he feels me." This is how the Holy Father teaches us to read these moments, not as signs of abandonment, but as tests of love. Because God never abandons you. Sometimes he hides to make you desire his presence more. And precisely when it seems to you that nothing is happening, the miracle is already taking place within you. One evening, during adoration in St. Peter's, Pope Leo the 14th remained in silence for long minutes before the Blessed Sacrament. No words, no music, only an immense quiet. Then he said, "This is the language of heaven, the silence that speaks, the presence that loves." And those present felt that those words were not only for those listening, but for the entire world. When the host remained still, it's as if God wanted to imprint that same lesson in your heart. He stops you, looks at you, loves you, and waits for you to understand that you don't need to do anything. Only remain, only believe, only love. It's here that the fifth truth is fulfilled. The Eucharist is God's breath within you, not something you receive and forget, but a presence that continues. Every communion is a spark that ignites the heart and illuminates life. And the more you live it with awareness, the more you become light for others. This is why Pope Leo the 14th invites us to share our experience. Because faith grows when it's told. Every story of grace, every small sign, can touch a soul that has lost hope. And when a believer tells what they've experienced with God, they become a witness of His love. How many people, after listening to the Pope's words, have found peace again? There are men and women who had abandoned Mass and now return every day. There are young people who, after years of distance, kneel again before the tabernacle. And there are elderly people who, in the silence of their home, offer their sufferings as a hidden prayer, all united by a single gesture: receiving the Eucharist and recognizing in that fragment of bread the face of eternal love. Pope Leo XIV often concludes his meditations on the Eucharist with words that contain the entire meaning of this mystery. We are not the ones holding God. It is He who chooses to remain. And when the host stops, it's the sign that His love has found home in your heart. This is the greatest lesson. You don't need to understand everything. You just need to let yourself be loved. Because every communion is an encounter, and every encounter with Christ is a miracle that continues to live within us. At the end of this journey, Pope Leo XIV invites us to a simple and decisive decision. Choose every day a small act of remaining. Remain in prayer when the mind wants to escape. Remain in goodness when pride demands revenge. Remain in service when fatigue suggests postponing. This choice, repeated humbly, becomes a concrete path of holiness within everyone's reach. The Pope also suggests a short prayer to be repeated like a breath. Jesus, remain with me and make me capable of remaining. Many faithful have written about using it in hospital corridors, during sleepless nights, in supermarket lines, small altars lit in ordinary life. And here's another fatherly advice. After communion, give thanks with your own words. Don't be afraid to tell Jesus what you truly feel, even if it's confusion, even if it's dryness. The Lord loves the truth of the heart, not perfect phrases. Finally, bring the Eucharist into relationships. Choose a possible reconciliation, a hidden act of charity, listening without haste. These are concrete ways to let the received grace find space and put down roots. Whoever lives this way discovers day by day that Mass is not a separate chapter of life, but the lifeblood that runs through it. And when hard days come, you won't be without strength. The presence you've guarded in peaceful times will become your rock. And now, if you too have experienced a similar moment, if during Mass you felt that mysterious presence that stopped you, comment below, Jesus, remain with me. Your testimony can help someone who today needs to rediscover faith. Hit that like button if you felt peace in your heart listening to these words. Share this video with those you love, and subscribe to our channel to walk every day closer to God's light. Because every shared word, every gesture of faith, can be the spark that ignites a new conversion. And always remember this: every time you receive the Eucharist, even in silence, even when you feel nothing, God is telling you only one thing: I am here, and I will never leave you.